Welcome back to the upper room. My name is Sheldon Mosbach. This is part two of what's turning into a series of the fruit of Eden, the intoxication of the flesh, question mark. And I am going to avoid doing a recap. You will be very lost, I believe, if you do not watch the first video. The first video covers the relationship between the Greek word soma, meaning body, and the Hindi word soma, meaning a ritual drink, which is surmised to be something akin to the fruit that Eve partook of in the Garden of Eden. And I've had a development which first led to quite a bit of confusion, but eventually resolved itself, for the most part, into something rather fascinating. So the first hurdle began in Isaiah 7. So let's take a look at it. Isaiah 7 verse 14 says, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Emmanuel meaning with us is God. Emmanuel, who we understand as Jesus Christ himself. And this is coherent insofar as we understand Jesus to be the Spirit of God incarnated in the flesh among us as human beings. With us is God, Jesus Christ. And it says something curious, that butter and honey shall he eat. Now, this is kind of strange because what comes after that is that he eats it so that he may know to refuse evil and choose good. Now that's very strange, because usually one would say, well, maybe he'll eat, milk and honey because, well, Emmanuel, Jesus, this son that'll be conceived, he's going to need some food, and he'll eat so that he can grow. So, milk will be a nice source of fat and protein, and babies need that because their bodies are growing, and maybe he'll eat honey because, well, that's a good source of carbohydrates, sugar. And milk can go bad sometimes, so maybe if it goes bad, then honey has a shelf life that's like indefinite. It'll last forever, so if they run out of milk, they can always get some honey. No, but it doesn't say anything about nourishment, only that he should know to refuse the evil and choose the good. That's Jesus that we're talking about. And beyond that this food should impart knowledge upon eating. What we ought to do is go back to our guidance here. Okay? This is a time for strong meat. Tough stuff that we got to chew on. It belongs to them that by reason of use have their senses exercised. And here's what I'm immediately saying. This doesn't make sense. So let's chew on it. Food that imparts knowledge upon eating. Doesn't make sense because I've never eaten butter or milk or cream or honey and then come to know good and evil. That's certainly not happened to me. But what's interesting is to note that there's a common element between Isaiah 7 and Genesis 3. And that is that there is food eaten that imparts knowledge upon eating. The serpent tells Eve that you shall not surely die if you eat of this fruit, but that you'll know good and evil. Just like this milk and honey shall impart a knowledge of good and evil. And so what we have here is a place where something was ingested that imparted that knowledge, but we don't know what it is. It's not given to us here. This is in Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. But much farther on in the prophetic books, in Isaiah 7, we are given the identity of the food that was ingested that imparted this knowledge. So one comes to a logical conclusion. Perhaps this is the food the very same food that Eve ingested and then later shared with Adam. And beyond that we can notice more, what would be the word for it? More justification for that fact would be in 1 Samuel 14. We have common elements over here between Isaiah and Genesis. We have common elements here between Genesis and 1 Samuel 14. A prohibition to eat food, a location of this prohibition in the midst of trees, and a similar effect on the eyes after the eating of this food. We see here in Genesis that God commands that Adam shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in that day you shall surely die. 1 Samuel 14, Saul adjures the people, saying, "Cursed be the man that eat of any food." Do not do it. God says this in relationship to the Garden of Eden. And Saul says this in relationship to the time when him and his army and Jonathan come into a wood. That is a wooded place, a place with trees. Here's a place with trees, and here's a place with trees. And in here there was honey upon the ground. He put forth the end of the rod that was in his hand, dipped it in the honeycomb, and put this forbidden food into his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. And here, this forbidden food was eaten, her husband with her, and he did eat, and the eyes of them both were what? Opened. Just as in the previous video, this Haoma, which is cognate to this soma, same thing, just said to stimulate alertness, awareness, eyes opened, right? And so this to justify the fact that seemingly this is a pattern of Genesis, the Garden of Eden. It's a type, it's a shadow, and honey is a part of that. Just as we're shown here in Isaiah 7, that honey and milk, I'm going to use milk because I think it helps the understanding better, comes from this word in the Hebrew, hema, means sour milk or cream or curd. And so what happens is this presents a couple of problems. Firstly, because if this is true, the honey and the milk and the honey, are the things ingested in Genesis. The first problem is that milk comes from cows, honey comes from bees, and soma, or Haoma, comes from a plant. So that the substance ingested by Eve cannot be this and this at the same time. So one of them has to be wrong. That's a conundrum, right? So it for a while, it made me consider just taking this down because it might be a stumbling block. And further, that I'm not sure how honey and milk can be the fruit of Genesis, because how can those two things share an identity if we know that trees don't produce milk or honey? So it becomes an issue. And so that first concern being like, well, this milk and honey certainly can't be the soma, until I took a closer look and I realized something very curious. I said, well, it can't be that. Let's take a second look through. But then I notice that of these physical attributes, one of them is that it is golden. Now I'm fully aware that it's golden green. This isn't perfect, and this doesn't have to make sense. Okay, so I'm not forcing it. I'm just walking it through. I'm just forcing it through the grinder. Let's chew it out. And secondly, that down here, a central element in the legend surrounding the conception, this deity here, happens when they took a piece of the plant and mixed it with, curiously enough, milk. So this plant, whose juice is said to be golden, green, right? Let's leave it for golden for now. It's just said to be golden, mixed with milk. So golden like honey and milk around conception. Golden soma, like honey and milk at conception. Okay. So the gears are turning, the mind is spinning. What in the world is going on here? So what you could say, or what I could come to a conclusion of is, well, nothing conclusive, but what's here is that soma and the milk and honey seem to be as yet equivalent. They seem to be equivalent. Because they share all of the similar characteristics. And what that leaves then is this problem. Once again, how can they share an identity if we know that trees don't produce milk or honey? Could it be that the words milk and honey are meant to describe certain saps, thus fruits? And I think this is the biggest hurdle to get over. I think perhaps the hardest part is that, not that it's wrong to use the word fruit in English, but that the word fruit as it exists now in the common understanding of the English language is insufficient to point to exactly what it is that Eve consumed. Because in our English language, the word fruit generally is the fully grown produced thing that is sweet to the taste. Whereas in other senses of the word, like fruit of the womb, we see this in scripture, right? Fruit of the womb. Then we understand fruit in a broader context, which I think is what we have to do here. We have to understand fruit in the much broader concept of anything that a thing produces. And so if a tree produces fluids within itself, like sap, things of that nature, we could call it a fruit because it produces that thing. Just like in scripture, they can call a baby a fruit of the womb. And certain, a fruit of your action, a fruit of being nice and kind to other people could be that you have good relationships. That's a fruit of your kindness to others. So could it be that it was like saps from a tree that were ingested? Further, are the words milk and honey used instead of sap, right? Because that would be the next question. Well, if the fruit in the garden, I got to get away from fruit. If the thing ingested in the garden was sap, why wouldn't they use a word like sap? or fluids of the tree or waters of the tree or something like that. Could it be that they used milk and honey in order that the terms are broad enough to point qualitatively to realities that remain true both externally and internally? In other words, that the qualities of milk and honey, the qualities, what color, how they, that they're liquid, what they taste like, what they do, right? That those true qualities exist externally, like in that tree out there, but also inside of you. So that the statement is true across all domains. I'll expand on that, and I think it'll come into focus. And could it also be akin to the understanding meant in other parts of Scripture where things like water and bread weren't meant to be understood as literal physical water or literal physical bread, as in the sense of like the Samaritan woman at the well, where Jesus asks her for water and then later describes to her this thing called living water, which she should drink and that she'll never thirst again. And that even after he describes this living water, we are to understand it is not literally physical water. It is spiritual water. And spiritual water is a thing that exists as water because of the way we understand water in the physical. That it nourishes, that it brings to life, that it brings out of drought. You know, it brings back, it allows things to flourish, but not in the physical, more of the spiritual. And of the spiritual, more of the mind. And when we want to understand that better, just go back to the video on mind, soul, and spirit. We can discuss how that's the case. Transformations of mind happen in the spirit. Same thing with bread, because we know that Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, but we know that he's not a walking loaf of bread, right? We know that this is figurative because bread is a thing which nourishes if it is eaten. He is the word. He says, eat my word, that you may be nourished by it, sustained by it. So rather the essence of what they are and how they behave in the spirit. That's what these physical words, how they are, what their essence is, points to how they behave in the spirit and in the mind. Spiritual water, spiritual bread from a spiritual rock. So what do I mean by some of this stuff? Is that, firstly, we don't know what the fruit is. We know for a fact that it's not an apple. The Bible does not specify the type of fruit. It uses this term, but it doesn't identify it. And further, that this term, peri, is much broader than just a piece of fruit as we understand it in the English. It's a thing which produces another thing. That which is produced, that's a fruit. And that the apple's association with forbidden fruit is a common misconception. It is a misconception. The actual identity of the fruit remains a topic of debate. And so it is wrong in that there's no textual evidence. But it is right in some regard, in that it reflects a thing desirous and sweet, something hard to say no to. And why is that right? Is because that's how temptation presents itself in your life and in mine. That's how temptation is. But what the apple fails to do is move past that. So what else could it be? Well, we found that curious relationship between soma of Hindi and soma of Greek. Soma of Greek means body, and this means that ingested substance. So phonetically they're equivalent. But trees don't grow drinks, but can trees produce liquids? If trees produce sap or resin, are those liquids appropriately called the fruit of the tree? And I would argue that they are. And curiously enough, that they generally match the colors of these two things, honey and milk. This is what a fig tree looks like when it's being harvested for its sap. This white milky substance. Here's it's harvested for the same type of material from its fruit, from a fig before it is fully ripe. Let's look into these things. What is that white liquid called? It's latex, or plant latex. It's produced in specialized cells, has all kinds of ingredients inside of it. Which plant groups contain latex? Well, there's a whole bunch of them, but what's really interesting here is that fig plants, that's what this is, right? So among this group of plants, they all produce this latex. And figs are part of the family called Moraceae. Rubber plant and ficus. And what's interesting to note is that we don't know the fruit per se. We are also not told explicitly what the tree is. What's interesting is that it's traditionally associated with various interpretations, that of the most common is the fig tree. So the tree of knowledge was a fig tree. The belief is supported by the fact that after Adam and Eve ate from the tree, they used fig leaves to cover themselves, suggesting a connection between the tree and the fig. Okay. So it is that the fig tree of the Moraceae family, a ficus tree, is most prominently associated with the tree from which a substance was eaten that led to death and flesh. Or, well, what's the best way to put it? That led to the consequence of sin and death in the flesh. I suppose that's the best way to put it. And what we can do is just start breaking down these words. We have figs, we have Moraceae family. What's best is to note this first. What does acei mean? Acei is a Latin termination. It goes on the end of a word and it means this: plants of the nature of. That's all it means. So Moraceae is plants of the nature of this. M-O-R, more. Okay. Since this is a Latin termination, let's look to Latin words. And let's look at all the Latin words that we can that have this sort of prefix on it. M-O-R, more. So we have a whole bunch of words, a long list of them. Starting with morbosus, morbus, morcella, all the way down to mortalis. And on the left here, their definitions. Let's take note of the conceptual landscape of all the words, beginning with mor. Once again, the word drawing upon a conceptual field of death and sickness. Let's take a look. Sickly, unhealthy, diseased, disease, sickness, stinging, sharply, caustically, biting, bite, hurt, pain. Dying, fool, jester, decay, die, expire, annihilation, corpse, death, anguish, bite, death, mortality. So, it's fairly clear that this is not random. Plants of the nature of more, which is death, decay, pain, and hurt. And that actually, it's not even just in this language. The same relationship is found in the Hebrew root, more. And we can see that So without going off on too far of a tangent with Hebrew, Hebrew is a very unique language in the fact that it started out as what's called an abjad. An abjad is a language that doesn't have any vowels. It just spells itself out in consonants, and so they didn't used to have them. MRR, and then you could say any variation, marar, moror, meror, miror, all that stuff, and that they each have a meaning, and all of them pertain to bitterness, right? Mor, mur, bitterness, bitterness, mora, bitterness, bitter thing, bitter herb, maror, merora, bitter thing, gall or poison, merera, meriri, bitter, merirut, bitterness, right? So, bitter, death is death, a bitter thing, right? Uh, Specifically, it points to myrrh, more specifically, more meaning myrrh, but also change. But also that change is often a result of a bitter thing. It's not until, I think this is possibly an etymological coincidence, but it probably caused the popular mind to relate change, or at least change marked by this verb, to bitterness, either as a cause or consequence. So very interesting and there's a lot of depth to it, right? So beyond that, to notice that this concept of death in the tree also expresses itself physically by the nature of this white sap, which is kind of a milky substance called latex, milky white fluid. Etymology from Latin, fluid, so it means fluid, but so closely phonetically related to lact, right? Lactic, which is where we get, the same word in English, which means milk. So fluid, milk. And we can do the same thing with an investigation of the word for milk in Latin. We can look at a long list of words that all have LAC, lac, and look to the conceptual landscape of all the words beginning with that lac. And yes, it does begin with, milk or milky juice of plants and lactis. But as soon as we step down, lacer, laceratio, laceratrix, lacerna, then it begins to change. Maimed, dismembered, mangled, mangling, tearing, cruel, open mantle or cloak. I don't even have a problem with that because we'll point to this in a second. This idea of a cloak, where in Job 10, he says, "Have you not poured me out like milk and curdled me like cheese? You have clothed me like a cloak." Sure, with skin and flesh like milk, right? Attack, assail, provoke, exude, sap, weeping, little tear, tear, mournful, tearful, breaking into tears, tear making, shed tears, weep. Lacrima, right? So it's in English language too. Like if you're in the medical field, these would be your lacrimal ducts. These are where your tears come from. Lacrima. Lactans, full of milk, sap, juicy. And so what we see is that these words aren't random and that they reflect far deeper concepts. And they are concepts that express themselves in the physical reality of them. A tree of death that has milk, that have death, that uh, point to death. And then further, as I mentioned, that when we come back to this this part of Scripture. We can use some parallelism to help ourselves understand what's being said here a little bit better. It says, we're going to call this milk just because I find it more easy for explanation. And I think it's right. I don't think it's wrong to do so, to change this butter to milk. Milk and honey he will eat. Let's use parallelism. Milk, that he may know to refuse evil. Honey, that he may choose to do good. Right? I'm just doing that because of the order in which we approach them, or that they present themselves to us. It talks about butter first, and then honey second. It talks about evil first, talks about good second. So block these together and block these together. So that's parallelism. And does it make sense? Well, how do we exercise our senses, right? Hebrews 5 or 6 or whatever. Let's exercise our senses. How do I know milk? How do I experience it? I know it's food. I know it's good for food. But I know it's primarily fat and lipids, and that if I leave it out on the counter for a day, it'll spoil. It goes bad fast. And I guess flesh is kind of like that too. It is something that surely doesn't last forever. It surely decays and dies and spoils, right? That's what Job 10 points to. Job 10 verse 8, thine hands have made me and fashioned me together round about, yet you do destroy me. Remember, I beseech thee, that you've made me as the clay. And will you bring me into dust again? Have you not poured me out as milk and curdled me like cheese? Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh. You've fenced me with bones and sinews. You've granted me life and favor, and your visitation has preserved my spirit. So he mentions these three things: clay, milk, skin, and flesh. Why? So that your mind will understand that these things all relate to each other conceptually and overlap. Clay is not milk, and milk is not clay, and clay is not skin and flesh, and it's not milk either. But they are related to each other. All things are relationship. God is relationship. That's all he is. So how do these relate to one another? Through death. Through the fact that they come and go quickly, and that they are not alive, really. You know, that's in that video on body, soul, and spirit. We show how these things like clay, dirt, and matter, the matter that we exist in, is dead. It is death, right? And that further, even this conceptual element of fat with evil and that which spoils is relevant in Leviticus 3, where regarding the sacrifices, it says, all the fat is the Lord's. It's for the Lord. It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations throughout all your dwellings, that you eat neither fat nor blood. So don't eat the fat. Don't eat the blood. Refuse the evil. Refuse the milk, the flesh. So then we look to honey, and we can typify it with spirit, flesh and spirit. Spoils in a day, lasts indefinitely. You can keep this on a shelf for 3,000 years, and honey will not go bad. And in Psalm 119, we're going to have a clue into it, right? How sweet are your words? And, it says words are spirit, right? Let's see if we can find it up here. John 6:63, the words I have spoken to you are spirit and life, those things which transform the mind. And what about them? Spirit lasts indefinitely. You choose, right? Free will. Do you align yourself with the flesh? Do you align yourself with the spirit? How sweet are your words? Those things are the spirit. It's not talking about physical honey. How sweet are your words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth, right? And so we have this idea that plays itself out. And we also can point back to this idea over here where there's this curious anthropomorphism, right? The substance ingested, this liquid, is called a divinity, a beautiful man that is wise and gives insight. In the same way that this tree is said to be pleasant to the eyes and desired to make one wise. Yet also it is a tree, and in Mark 8, this blind man who is cured by Jesus says, I see men as trees. Anthropomorphism. Now, I could go a little bit deeper on this, but maybe it's for another video, but just to understand too that this serpent that is being spoken of seems to be more than just a serpent. It's a nahash. It seems to be a spiritual being of sorts. For sake of not confusing the issue, let's just focus on this though. That there's an anthropomorphism here. It was pleasant to the eyes, good to make one wise. And that when we map this onto our understanding, you say, okay, well, trees, men as trees, body as a tree, body as a tree, nervous system without the flesh, flipped upside down, out of which grows the branches of a tree. And well, if this was anything like a tree, are there any, a tree produces fluids and saps and resins and gums and resins. And how are they produced? Well, the word resin is a plant secretion. It's harvested from plants. It's secreted as a response to injury. And of frankincense, at least, trees start producing this secretion at about 8 to 10 years old. Tapping is done, the harvesting, 2 to 3 times per year, with the final taps producing the best tears. These tears are valuable. So if physical trees produce these substances which are valuable for aromatics and analgesics, pain relievers, valuable products, does our tree produce products that are valuable to myself or to others? What are biological products and how are they made? August 1st, 2025. Biological products represent a distinct class of medical and industrial substances derived from living organisms. Biological products originate from living systems, such as humans. These products are distinct from conventional pharmaceuticals because they're manufactured within or extracted from biological sources. So not only have we perhaps taken a step closer to what was meant by what happened when Eve ate from this tree. It was more than just eating. It was more of an act of intimacy wherein she merged with something. Just like eating is intimate in the fact that you take something, you put it in you, and it becomes a part of you. Eve tastes death, and death becomes her. And her with Adam, and that our estate in this place now is that we inhabit this death, and it pulls us away with its passions and its drives. And just like physical trees produce tears of sap upon the infliction of wounds that are valuable, the trees of our nervous system produce things that are valuable. And now this, to open up a whole nother discussion. Maybe this is what human trafficking is part of. Where inflicting bodily damage produces unique compounds that are used for specific purposes. I think that's for a whole nother discussion. But I think, despite not having a perfect answer for exactly what it is that took place in the Garden of Eden, I feel a couple steps closer. Soma is the body which was tasted, flesh was tasted, and death was tasted. And because she tasted it, it became her, and she shared with her husband. They became flesh, they became death. That is our estate. If you found any part of this video intriguing, compelling, thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe. Please leave your comments if you have any suggestions or corrections about anything I've walked through here. And until next time, this is The Upper Room with Sheldon Mosbach. Thanks for joining me. Take care.